They said the lighthouse was built to keep ships from ruin. But what if the light itself was the ruin? One man remained, long after the others vanished, and before he died, he left behind a confession no one was meant to read. This is the bitter truth of the last lighthouse keeper. This will be long, so settle in. I'll deliver it as if it's ready for direct narration. The sea opens in silence, an expanse of gray, endless, restless, shifting. Salt mist drifts through the air, cold, heavy, clinging to skin. At the far edge of that silence, rising from jagged cliffs of black stone, stands a tower, white at first, but the storms have eaten it. Wind and salt have stained it, black streaks running down its sides like tears. Iron bolts, once shining, now rust red, and at the top, behind a crown of glass, a light turns, always turning, always burning, never stopping, never sleeping. The lighthouse on the edge of the world. The records call it a beacon of safety. The villagers called it something else. The priests had said it was holy, raised on prayer, sealed in salt, guarded by the cross, a tower meant to save ships from ruin. But the fishermen did not bow when they passed it. They did not lift their eyes to its light. They rode beneath it in silence, because to them it was not a blessing, it was a warning. One man remembered it clearly, an old fisherman, hands gnarled by rope, skin cracked from decades of sun and salt. He said, when the beam swept across the water, it was like being chosen, as if something vast and white was looking down on you, marking you. I never wanted it to land on me. Never. The villagers worked in the rhythm of the tide. They had always feared the sea, but they respected it. The sea gave, and the sea took. Nets heavy with fish 1 week, torn and empty the next. A boat returned home in calm waters, another dragged down in sudden squalls. That was the bargain. That was the way of life. But after the lighthouse was built, the bargain seemed to change. The fish grew scarce. The tides shifted. Currents once familiar turned strange. Boats drifted farther from shore, their oars straining against waters that no longer obeyed. And the storms grew louder, not in number, in voice. When lightning struck, it lit the tower, and the fishermen swore the sea roared back. The priests dismissed their fears. They spoke of progress, of God's will, of salvation for sailors. They said the villagers were ungrateful, clinging to superstition. But the men of the coast knew better. They had lived too long beside the waves, not to hear their language. They whispered among themselves. The sea did not want the light. To the sea resented its glow. The sea was restless, because something unnatural had been set upon its edge. And still the tower stood, day after day, night after night. The lantern at its peak burned with perfect rhythm, never faltering, never flickering, too steady. Because lighthouses falter, their flames choke in rain, their keepers stumble in sleep, their mirrors rust, their glass fogs. But this one did not once, not in the first year, not in the 5th, not even when storms rose so high that whole cottages were swallowed by waves. The village burned its candles down to stubs, the church roof leaked, the boats split on the rocks, but the tower's light never dimmed, and that was what frightened them most. One journal survives from that time, a builder's record. It lists stone by stone, cost by cost, worker by worker, every detail accounted for, every labor hour written down, except one. In the margin, almost hidden, a single line. We were told to build here. We did not choose. We did not question who gave the order. No name is written, no authority claimed, just the command. The priest said it was God's will. The fishermen said nothing, but in their silence was fear. They stopped fishing near the cliffs. They took longer routes, rowing farther, losing days of work to avoid the shadow of the tower. At night, when the beam swept across the sea, they bowed their heads and whispered prayers, not of thanksgiving, but of protection. One widow confessed to her son before she died, "I never feared the sea, until that light began to move. The waves are one thing, but that light, it was looking for something, and I feared it would find me." The light did not guide, it watched, it judged, it never blinked. Some called it the eye of God, others, the eye of something else. But whatever it was, the people lived beneath it. Day after day, year after year, the sea did not calm, the storms did not ease, the bargain remained broken, and so the whisper spread. Maybe the lighthouse was not built to protect. Maybe it was built to contain. There were nights when the villagers swore they heard it. Not the wind, not the thunder, but something beneath the cliffs. A low vibration, a sound like voices carried in the waves. Like the ocean itself had begun to murmur back. The priests warned them not to speak of it. They called it blasphemy. They burned offerings of salt and incense at the base of the tower, declaring the land consecrated. But the villagers knew incense does not change the tide, and blessings do not change the pull of the sea. The tower stood, the light turned, and the sea waited. Years passed, and though the records call it progress, though the priests called it holy, the villagers began to call it by another name. They called it the bitter light, because they knew what it cost. They had lost their nets, their sons, their boats, and in return, they had gained an eye that would not close. One man wrote in his diary, "I believe the sea hates us now. I believe it hates the light. I believe the sea will take what it is owed." But the sea did not take the tower, not then, not yet. It waited, as if in patience, as if in hunger, and in that waiting, men kept the flame. They climbed its spiral stair, they turned its gears, they polished its glass, they did their duty, and all the while, they wrote in their journals, small notes at first, weather reports, tide patterns, ship sightings. But slowly, other words appeared, words of unease, words of suspicion, words of fear. Those words would come later in full, but even in the earliest entries, you can feel the tremor, because from the very first night, the lantern turned. Something was wrong, and that wrongness would never leave them. The sea had changed, the light had changed, and the men who stood between them would not remain whole. The lighthouse had been raised as salvation, but salvation always demands sacrifice, and the villagers were left to wonder whose sacrifice had already been made, and whose was yet to come. Because the light burned on, the sea rose higher, and the silence of the coast was no longer silence. It was listening and watching, waiting for the moment when the first keeper would put pen to paper and confess what he had seen. The first confession of many, the bitter confessions that would follow, the confessions that should never have been found. And beneath it all, one truth remained. The sea resented the light, and the light resented the sea, and in between, men stood, trapped, guarding a flame that was not theirs, and the cost of keeping it had only just begun. The path to the tower wound upward in silence, a narrow trail cut into black stone, slick with moss, steep with years of rain. At its end, the lighthouse stood against the horizon, a pale figure of stone, rising above the sea, its lantern still burning. He was the new keeper, the last, though he did not yet know it. His name does not matter, the records hold it, but it is only a name among many. There had been others before him, men who arrived with steady hands and steady faith, men who promised to serve,
men who either vanished or went mad. The parish did not speak of that. They wrote of duty, of honor, of service, and so another man was sent to climb the stairs, to wind the gears, to tend the flame. He brought little with him, a trunk with clothes, a tin of tobacco, and a journal, a thick leather-bound book, its pages clean, its lines waiting to be filled. The first entries are precise. He wrote in the manner of an accountant, every tide measured, every change of weather recorded, wind speed, temperature, the passing of ships marked with care. The words were neat, the ink steady, the voice calm, but something wasn't right. Between the lines, a silence lingered. You can feel it even now, the way his sentences pause, the way the ink rose faint, as if his hand had hovered too long before continuing. He was not a superstitious man. The parish had chosen him for that reason. They needed someone practical, someone unshaken by old tales, someone who would not bend to whispers of fishermen, and for a time, it seemed he was exactly that. His records are meticulous. On the third day he notes, lantern trimmed, beam hold steady, 3 ships passed safely. On the 7th storm heavy, glass rattled, flame secure. On the 12th all quiet, sea rough, but it is in what he does not write that the unease begins. There are gaps, spaces where words should be, whole days marked only with the word calm, but the handwriting shifts from bold to faint, from clean to hurried, from certainty to hesitation, and that's when he heard it. The first sound comes late in the night. The journal entry is brief, noise in stairwell, no one present. The next night, again, sound repeated, as though someone climbing, stairs empty, and then nothing. No explanation, no attempt to reason, just silence. The following week, the entries return to weather, to tides, to passing ships, as if the sounds had never been. But the silence grows louder. The handwriting changes once more. It leans, it trembles. By the 3rd week, the sentences are shorter, abrupt, cut off before their thought is finished. At first you might not notice. The precision distracts. The facts remain. The records are still clear. But beneath them, the tone shifts. You can feel it. And when you read them aloud, the pause between words feels heavier.
Like a man weighing each syllable, measuring his fear, hiding it between numbers. The villagers said the keepers never lasted. They said the tower took something from them, that one by one they left changed. Eyes hollow, faces pale, or worse, never left at all. But he continued his duty. He climbed the spiral stair each morning. He wound the iron weights that turned the lens. He polished the glass until it shone, and every night the lantern burned, never faltering, never dimming. And yet, with each passing week, the journal faltered to by the 2nd month. His words turned inward, no longer only of ships or storms, but of silence, of the weight of stone pressing down, of the sound of waves that seemed too near, even when the sea lay far below. He wrote of a heaviness in the air, of nights when the flame's glow felt too bright, too steady, like something unnatural, something watching. And he began to write of loneliness, not the simple loneliness of a man alone in a tower, but of a deeper kind, the loneliness of a man who feels unseen, unheard, unwelcome, the kind of loneliness that does not belong to a human being, but to a place, to the tower itself. Still, he did not stop. His entries continued, each day marked, each page filled, until the words began to thin, until they became not records, but whispers. By the 3rd month, the sentences had changed. Wind restless, the sea unsettled, the light feels heavier, and it finally, I am not sure who I am writing to. That was when the calm precision ended. From that day forward, the voice of the journal was no longer steady. His. It was quiet, uneven, desperate, to not yet madness, not yet confession, but the beginning of a descent no keeper before him had survived, the beginning of a truth that would not stay buried, and the first sign that the tower was already working upon him, because his words were not his own anymore. They belonged to the lighthouse, and the lighthouse had only just begun to speak. To the sea was black that night, not the deep blue of daylight, not the gray churn of storms, but a flat, swallowing black, as if the horizon had been erased. The lighthouse beam swept across it, steady, mechanical, and unblinking. It cut through nothing and revealed nothing, but the keeper was not looking at the water. He was listening. At first, it was only the whistle of the wind in the iron railings, the distant crash of waves against stone. Then beneath that, fainter, slower, words, a tune, something old. They were hymns. The sound rose and fell like the tide, carried on air that should have been empty. No village voices drifted up the cliff at this hour. No church doors stood open after midnight. And yet, there they were, men's voices, women's voices, together, weaving a song as though a congregation knelt just beyond the walls. The keeper stood very still. The lantern swung above him, its massive gears humming. His own breath seemed loud in his ears, and that's when he heard it. Not only the song, but the echo. The stairwell below, hollow and winding, seemed to catch the sound and carry it upward, as if the stone itself wanted to join in. He wrote in his journal later, "The sea sings, not with storms, but with prayer. I heard it clear as my own voice. If I were to deny it, I would be a liar before God." By morning, the waves had quieted. The gulls cried their usual hunger, and yet his face remained pale, as though he had woken from a dream that refused to loosen its hold. Fishermen noticed too. When the light turned across the horizon, they swore that shadows bent within it. One captain told of seeing a dark figure stretched across the beam, as if someone were standing in front of the lamp itself, though the lantern chamber had been locked. But another said the beam seemed to split, as though catching the outline of a mastless ship that moved where no vessel could. The water was empty. The light insisted it was not. Villagers at the foot of the cliff grew wary. They had always kept their distance, but now they stopped climbing altogether. The path up was steep, cut into the rock, with steps worn down by decades of boots. But after dusk, not a soul dared set foot upon it. They said the cliff groaned, that if you lingered at the base too long, you could hear someone descending, heavy, deliberate, step after step, and yet, no one ever emerged. The keeper continued to write, at first, in neat lines, his script tight and controlled, then looser, hurried. The presence in the stairwell, he recorded one night. I did not see it, but I felt it. I passed through it like mist, but heavier, slower. Gasp, my chest was tight for hours after. On another page, I have begun to dread the climb. It is not the labor, it is not the height, it is that I do not ascend alone. The ink blotted darker at the edges, as though his hand shook, and yet, duty kept him there. The light had to turn, the flame had to burn. Ships needed their path across the water, but something wasn't right. He found himself hesitating before opening the door to the stairwell, listening too long, straining for silence, knowing silence would not last. To times he climbed faster, not to escape fatigue, but to escape the sense of something rising below him, keeping pace. Nights grew longer, the hymns more insistent. Not words anymore, but syllables blurred into sound, carried through stone,
until the whole tower seemed to breathe with them. And one night, as he set his lamp to check the winding steps, he thought he saw it. Not a face, not a form, just a darker shadow in the shadow, pausing one turn beneath him. He did not stay to confirm it. He shut the door, he locked it, and he prayed the lock would be enough. But prayer travels both ways. When he opened his journal that night, the ink pulled too thick, till the words ran. The line he tried to write dissolved into a shape he swore he did not make. It was not his handwriting, and he left the page blank. The light kept turning, the waves kept striking, but the keeper's eyes no longer trusted the dark between them, because in the stairwell, someone else had already begun the climb. To the sea rose higher with every passing week. What had once been restless waves became something heavier, slower, more deliberate, as though the ocean itself was drawing breath. Storms rolled in without warning. Clouds blackened faster than the keeper could light the lamps. The tower shook under the weight of the wind. Windows rattled in their frames. And beneath it all, somewhere below the stone foundation, another sound began to rise. At first he thought it was the crash of surf against the cliff, the endless percussion of water breaking rock. But it carried a rhythm. It carried tone. It was singing. The keeper pressed his ear to the cold walls of the stairwell, listening, and there, just faintly, came voices, not from above, not from the lantern, not even from the storm, from below, from the sea. He wrote in his log that night, "The waves are not waves. They chant, they respond to each other, as though a choir kneels beneath the waterline, answering some command I cannot hear." But something wasn't right. The longer he listened, the less the words resembled prayer. Not Christian hymns, not sailors' shanties, something older, rising and falling in tones that did not match human breath, carved syllables that seemed too heavy for a throat to carry. And yet, he understood. His next entry was not a record of wind speed, nor tide. It was a prayer, written in a hand that began neatly, but ended with slanted strokes that bled into one another. It read, "O Lord of depth, keep the flame. O Lord of silence, turn the light. O Lord of many, let the stair be empty tonight." None of those titles belonged to saints. None belonged to Christ. The handwriting faltered more each night. Straight lines curled, letters doubled back on themselves, numbers twisted into symbols. It was as though his own hand no longer obeyed him. And that's when he heard it. The voices swelled louder during storms. Thunder cracked above. Lightning split the horizon. And through the roar of rain, he swore the choir was rising. Not drowned, not struggling, but triumphant. The stones at the base of the tower seemed to vibrate with it. The steps shuddered under his boots. And once when he leaned too close, he felt warmth rising from the cracks, as if something breathed against the foundation. Fishermen would not sail near the point. They said the sea there did not move right. Waves folding back into themselves, as if something below pulled them down. One swore he heard music even from the deck of his boat, carried up through the hull. He returned to shore pale, refusing to speak of it again, that the keeper could not leave. His duty chained him to the tower, and with every storm, his records grew less precise. Pages that should have carried weather charts were filled instead with slanted scripture. The choir calls. The sea has memory. The voices rise because they must be heard. Sometimes he crossed out his own words. Other times he left them untouched, staring back in the dim glow of the oil lamp, as if he himself could not remember writing them. He began to pray before each descent of the stair. Not prayers from his catechism, not the Lord's Prayer, but fragments of the chants he had heard from below. And though his lips trembled, he could not stop himself. He was no longer guiding the words were guiding him. The storms did not pass, they grew. The sea beat against the stone like a drum, and in the hollow moments between thunder, the choir sang louder. The last page of his log that week was smudged by water, or perhaps by tears. The line ran, broken and uneven. The sea no longer sings below, it sings within, and the rest of the page was blank. The sea lay still that morning, a strange stillness, neither calm nor inviting, but heavy, as though the water itself was waiting. Mist clung low across the surface, masking the horizon in a white wall that swallowed distance and sound.
And out of that wall came a boat. It carried 3 men, inspectors, sent by the Maritime office to investigate the lighthouse, and the strange reports that had begun to circulate. They wore heavy coats, their collars turned against the damp, notebooks tucked beneath oilskin to protect them from spray. Their task was simple: to climb the cliff, to speak to the keeper, to confirm that the light was being maintained. They never returned. The villagers at the base of the cliff watched their boat arrive, saw the figures disembark, heard their boots on the stone steps, and then nothing. Hours passed. The light above swung its endless arc, steady as always, but no men came back down. By nightfall the boat was gone, not tied to the post, not pulled to shore, but drifting out again, untended, unmanned, its small lantern extinguished. But something wasn't right. The boat should have been caught in the current, should have carried far out into the channel. Instead it lingered just offshore, circling slowly, almost deliberately, as though an unseen hand guided it in patterns no tide could shape. When finally brought back to land, it was found empty. Not a scrap of clothing, not a drop tool, just damp wood and the faint smell of smoke. No trace of the inspectors was ever found. The keeper's log recorded their arrival in his usual hand: tide, wind, 3 men at the door. But the entry broke mid-sentence. The ink line dragged off the page, as though the pen had slipped from his grip. The following pages remained blank. Villagers whispered. They had always distrusted the lighthouse. Its light was too steady, too constant, as if it did not illuminate, but demanded to be seen. And now, with the inspectors gone, those whispers turned darker. The lighthouse was not guiding ships. It was calling them. Fishermen swore that their compasses faltered when the beam struck the deck, that the needle spun, confused, refusing to hold north. One said he dreamed of the light at night, a thin line pressing against his closed eyes, until he woke, sweating with the sound of waves breaking in his ears, though his home lay far inland. Others reported hearing bells where no bells should be, a single toll carried over the water, timed with the turning of the lantern, each note low, hollow, pulling at the chest, like grief. And that's when he heard it. The keeper himself wrote one final note in the margins of his log, his script uneven, slanting toward the edge of the paper. They have not left. The tower keeps them. Their voices move in the stairwell. They speak without mouths. No more words followed, only lines, circles, marks drawn and redrawn until the paper tore beneath the pressure. From that week on, no officials set foot on the cliff again. Letters were sent, orders drafted, but every man called to the task refused it. The risk was not the storm, not the height. It was what waited inside the tower. The boat remained the only proof of what had occurred, returned to shore without its crew, lantern dark, wood sodden with salt, and its slow circling path, carved into memory by every villager who stood on the rocks that day, watching the sea move where the men did not. The lighthouse beam turned above them still, but now, when it cut across the waves, few dared to look, because each time it passed, they wondered who had answered the call. The light still turned, through storm, through fog, through nights when the horizon was swallowed whole, and the stars gave no measure of the sky. It turned without hesitation, its machine unfeeling, its rhythm unwavering. But the man who kept it, the one whose hand wound the gears, whose breath lit the flame, was unraveling, thread by thread. His journal bore witness. What began as neat tables of tides, Winds and passing vessels soon lost its structure. Numbers once carefully aligned in margins bent sideways. Sentences began, then fractured midway. Ink spread too dark, as though pressed into the page by a hand that trembled. At first the change was subtle, a note where no note was needed, an observation repeated too often. But over time the careful record gave way to rambling, to words scratched into paper not for clarity, but for survival. The waves do not move as they once did. They turn upon themselves, circling, always circling. The foundation does not rest on stone, it rests on their backs. They shift beneath me. When the storm grows strong, each entry pulled further from order, each line slid closer to delirium. The man who had once measured weather with precision, now measured only dread. And yet, he stayed. He begged for release. He wrote of escape, but he did not leave the tower, as though something unseen tethered him to the flame above. But something wasn't right. Soon he began to describe faces, not faces of men, nor of villagers, not passing sailors or lost companions, but faces that appeared where they should not. He wrote of the lantern glass, polished, curved, reflective. It had once been his ally, amplifying the flame, casting light across the waves. Now it had become a mirror. Each night, as he climbed the stair and entered the chamber, he saw not himself, but another, eyes not his own, watching him from the glass, steady, patient, unblinking. The journal trembled with his words. I turned from the glass, I moved away, but the reflection did not move with me. And from that moment, time itself fractured. Days fell silent from the record, pages skipped whole intervals, as though hours no longer belonged to him. Nights collapsed into half-finished passages, words trailing into nothing, entries blurred together, time spilling into itself like water from a broken jar. And that's when he heard it, not the hymns carried faintly over the sea, not the choir rising from beneath the waves, but something closer, something within, whispers in the stairwell, not loud, not hurried, measured. Each phrase rose and fell with the turning of the lantern above. Each word matched its sweep across the horizon, as if the light itself spoke in rhythm, casting sound as well as vision. He pressed his palms to his ears until the skin bruised. He prayed louder than his own voice could bear, but the whispers threaded through every silence, filling each hollow of the tower, steady as breath. He could not escape them. He began to write those words down, not in English, not in any language he had been taught. Marks curved like waves cresting, marks jagged like cliffs breaking, entire pages filled with symbols. When he later looked upon them, he swore he did not remember writing them. The words were not his, the hand that wrote them was not his, the hand that wrote them was not his. The journal no longer read like a log, it read like scripture, not a scripture of comfort, a scripture of warning, a scripture of dissent. Do not climb the stair. Do not look into the glass, do not answer when they speak your name. And yet he climbed, he lit the lamp, he answered. Villagers began to notice the change. The beam itself no longer shone pure, it no longer cut sharp lines through fog. Its light bent strangely, green at the edges, pale as though filtered through seawater. Fishermen swore their compasses failed. When the light crossed their decks, needles spun aimlessly, refusing to point north. Others swore the beam reached them in sleep, thin and unrelenting, pressing behind their eyes. No matter how far inland they lived, they woke drenched in the sound of waves. The keeper's notes reflected the change. It no longer guides, it no longer warns, it searches. His handwriting faltered more each night. Straight lines bent, numbers curled into shapes, prayer bled into curse. And yet he continued. His duty chained him to the stair, his fear chained him tighter. By the final pages, words had collapsed into fragments, scrawled pleas scratched between ink blots. Release me. Silence the stair. Let the glass break. But the glass did not break. The stair did not fall silent, and he was not released. The last clear entry read only, they wait below, they circle, they rise. If I do not turn the light, they will come for me.
If I turn the light, they will come for you. After that, nothing coherent remained. Pages torn, ink spilled, marks gouged into paper with the tip of the pen, until the surface gave way. The lighthouse beam turned above still. The sea circled endlessly below, and within those walls, the man who once kept order had descended into a place without measure, a place no chart could mark, because whatever he had seen in the glass was not finished watching him. Would you like me to continue expanding this into the full approximately 260-word segment, scene by scene, until it matches the target length? The way I began with Chapter 1, the flame was low, it bent and wavered in the glass, smoke curling upward, staining the air with the faint bitter taste of burnt oil. The walls of the keeper's room sweated with damp, salt rising through the stone like blood through cloth, and on the table, beside the guttering candle, lay his journal, open blotched, the page crowded with words pressed so close together, they seemed to lean against one another, desperate not to fall. It was no longer a log, it was a confession. At first it read like prayer, measured, formal, words carefully chosen, as though the act of writing them could absolve him. But as the pages turned, the lines grew frantic, his hand no longer steady, his voice, if one could hear it, no longer calm. He wrote of the shoreline below the tower, how at certain hours of the night, when the tide was neither high nor low, he saw them, figures, not walking, not wandering, but kneeling in the surf, bodies bent forward, arms slack at their sides, and faces missing, not covered, not obscured, gone. He described the robes, heavy, drenched, clinging to frames that seemed too long, too rigid for men. The cloth shone wet beneath the moon, it clung like seaweed, it moved, even when the tide was still. He swore they did not come from the sea, nor from the cliffs above, but from the very point where stone met water, from the base of the lighthouse itself. The keeper confessed that at first he thought them sailors, drowned men washed back by the tide, but sailors do not kneel, sailors do not remain unmoving for hours, their heads tilted as though listening. Sailors do not lift their gaze, in unison, to the light above.
But something wasn't right. The journal grew darker here, the handwriting stretched thin, ink dragged into lines that shook and doubled. He wrote of the sound of iron, chains struck against rock, rust grinding against itself. Though when he looked, the shoreline was bare, and that's when he heard it. Not from the sea, not from the land, but from beneath the floor, where he sat, a slow, hollow pounding, as though something enormous struck from below, not with rage, not with urgency, but with rhythm, as though counting. He pressed his ear to the planks. Salt rose to meet him, sharp and metallic, and under the pounding he swore he heard voices, chanting, low and guttural, woven into the noise of surf. The keeper's confession shifted then. His tone broke. He no longer described, he warned. He claimed the lighthouse was not what it seemed, that the men who had built it had not done so to save ships, that the flame had not been lit to guard life. It was never meant to warn, it was meant to bind. The words repeated, scrawled across several pages, some inked, some carved, scratched so deep into the paper the blade tore through. It binds, it holds, it anchors what cannot be let free. The candlelight in his room burned lower as he wrote these lines, wax spilling down the sides in uneven rivers. The flame thinned, bent, stretched toward the glass, as though pulled by something beyond, and he did not stop. He confessed to dreams that were not dreams, waking with salt in his mouth, his hands raw, as though scraped against rock, the taste of iron thick at the back of his throat. He confessed to seeing shapes in the lantern glass, not reflections, not his own image bent by curve and flame, but the same figures, kneeling, waiting, pressing their faceless heads against the glass until it fogged with a breath that should not exist. He begged for forgiveness, begged for release, but the words collapsed upon themselves. His confession grew frantic, circling, repeating, phrases chasing one another without resolution. I did not build this place. I did not bind it. Why must I keep it? The light burns me. The iron sings to them. I cannot hold it any longer. At times his script grew so erratic. The letters dissolved into symbols. Not letters, not words. Marks that resembled hooks, chains, arcs of tide. Pages filled with nothing but these shapes. As though the confession itself had ceased to be his. He wrote of the foundation again, of the stones below blackened with salt, streaked with iron bolts driven deeper than reason allowed, bolts that held not the tower steady against storms, but something beneath, something that strained against them. By the last candle's gutter, his voice in the journal was no longer pleading. It was breaking. The sea does not move them. The storm does not bend them. They kneel because they are chained. They kneel because they wait, and the light holds them. And then one final line, scrawled so hard across the page it tore through, leaving the impression on the paper beneath. When the light fails, the anchor breaks. The candle died on that word. The wax hardened in silence, and above the lantern turned, but below in the tide, the kneeling figures did not move. They only waited, and he knew, as surely as the sea eroded stone, that his confession had not been written for God. It had been written for whoever came after him. The sea lay still that morning, a flat sheet of gray glass, unbroken by tide or wind. The lighthouse rose from it like a tooth, blackened at its base, pale at its crown, the lantern above turning in silence. No gulls wheeled in the air. No boats cut the surface. Only the tower and the waiting village gathered below the cliffs. For months, they had watched the flame, sometimes steady, sometimes faltering, and sometimes bending downward, as though pulled toward the sea instead of pushing against it. They had heard the hymns. They had seen the inspectors vanish. They had whispered that the keeper was no longer alone in the tower. At last, they petitioned the church. The priests came by cart, robed, pale-faced, their eyes already wary before they had even climbed the path. They carried censers of iron, swinging slow arcs of smoke that clung to their sleeves. Each step up the cliff was measured, ritualistic, as though they feared the land itself might give way beneath them. The villagers waited at the base. Not one followed them upward. Not after dusk. At the foot of the tower, the priests halted. Their chants rose, dry in the throat, carried more by duty than conviction. They crossed themselves, pressed oils into the stone, sprinkled holy water that hissed when it touched iron bolts rusted deep into the foundation. But something wasn't right. The priests entered. For hours the villagers saw nothing, only the lantern flame, above circling, steady, until at last the doors opened, and the men emerged. Their faces were gray with sweat. Their robes clung as though damp, though no rain had fallen. Yet their voices declared the same phrase, repeated with sharp finality. The sight is cleansed. Inside they gathered every page of the keeper's journals. They carried them in bundles down the stair, arms blackened with ink where wet pages stuck against their skin. The villagers stood back as the fire was lit. The books hissed, curled, crumbled. The smoke that rose from them was thick, bitter, carrying the scent of salt and something metallic. It burned the eyes. It hung low, refusing to rise. The priests did not stay to watch it end. They departed before the last pages were ash, their verdict spoken, their task complete, and so the villagers remained,
staring into the fire, into the fragments that refused to vanish. And that's when they saw it. Not words, not whole pages, but slivers of script clung to the charred paper, half phrases, scorched yet legible, iron below. They kneel, they do not leave. When the light fails, one villager, a boy, pulled a blackened scrap from the edge. He pressed it beneath his shirt, hiding it before his mother could slap it from his hands. Others did the same, not out of defiance, out of fear that the words themselves might still mean something. The fire died, the shore fell silent, and the lighthouse flame continued to turn. The church recorded the incident as resolved. Their official statement spread through nearby towns. The journals destroyed. The site blessed. The keeper, it was said, had drowned himself in grief, his body claimed by the sea. But no body was ever found, and the villagers knew something the priests would not speak. They had watched the sea themselves. They had seen the kneeling figures in the surf. Not once had the priests turned their eyes toward the water. Not once had they asked what lay beneath. Weeks passed, then months. The stone at the tower's base remained dark with salt. The bolts in the foundation continued to rust, deeper each day, orange bleeding into black. The scraps of the keeper's journal passed in whispers, carried in pockets, folded into walls, hidden beneath floorboards. Each fragment repeated the same words, a warning, written by a man who had vanished without a trace. When the light fails, the anchor breaks, and though the church had silenced the shore with fire, the silence was not peace. It was waiting, because no flame lasts forever, and the villagers knew that one night, perhaps not in their time, but soon, the lantern would falter, and the sea would answer.
The ruins lie jagged and silent where the tower once rose, a jagged tooth of stone and rusted iron clawing from the cliff into the grey swell of the sea. Broken stairwells and splintered beams strewn like bones along the shore, the lantern above long extinguished, yet somehow remembered by the wind and the fog that presses down and curls around the fragments of what was once a sentinel against storms, a beacon for the lost, a light that should have guided but never truly did. For the sea has its own memory, and it remembers what man has forgotten. It remembers the men who built this place, with hands trembling and hearts unaware of what they anchored beneath the stones. And it remembers the last keeper who tended the flame with dutiful care, even as he began to unravel, even as the faces in the glass and the shapes in the waves pressed against him with a patient hunger that no faith could abate. And now, years later, when the storms returned with a vengeance, sweeping the cliffs and pounding the rocks with a fury that seemed to argue with heaven itself, the tower succumbed, its walls collapsing into the tide, its ironwork groaning and twisting as the sea claimed it. Piece by piece, the bones of the lighthouse carried off into the waves and scattered along the coast like teeth from some great predator. Yet though the tower was gone, the scar remained, black bolts protruding from stone, salt streaked across the cliff face, and fishermen who dared near the wreckage began to speak in hushed voices of a light that should not exist, a beam that sliced through fog where no lantern stood, cutting a path across water as precise and unyielding as it had when the tower still turned, a light that moved with intention, circling and sweeping and pulling toward it those who did not heed warning, those who were tempted or desperate, those who sought guidance in its amber glow but found only absence and ruin. And the first of them vanished quietly, a pair of brothers returning from the herring grounds, their small craft swallowed by the fog after steering toward that impossible light, later discovered splintered upon the rocks, their nets trailing in the tide. their bodies claimed by nothing but the rumor of the sea. And it was only the beginning, for the beam appeared again and again, in nights thick with fog, in storms that churned the water, and scattered clouds across a moonless sky. Fishermen swearing, they saw it sweep from distant coves, reporting the way it moved, with a precision no human hand could command. The light that should have been extinguished, yet continued as if some anchor still held it aloft, some tether reaching beyond death and time. And the villagers on shore waited, watching, their eyes tracing the path across waves, knowing that those who followed it would never return, knowing that the journals, once hidden and burned, still whispered through the fragments that survived, warnings that bent their knees beneath the weight of truth. And still the stories grew, carried by those who had seen the empty wrecks, broken hulls dashed against rock, sails ripped, and ropes trailing in water, but bodies absent, the men swallowed whole as though the sea had opened to receive them. And each time a boat vanished, the fog seemed thicker, afterward, heavier with a scent of iron and salt, and some other residue that clung to skin and hair, and lingered in the throat of those who remained, a residue that tasted of memory, and warning, and the things that dwell beneath the water, when man is not watching. And the villagers began to mark nights when the beam appeared, counting the full moons and storm cycles, noting the pattern though no pattern could truly contain it. And when the light shone, it pulled like a magnet, coaxing those at sea into currents they could not resist, into waves that seemed to part for them, and yet split them, tearing the hulls and leaving only emptiness to answer the cries of those left behind. And the priests who came once to bless the shore were long gone, their words scattered and forgotten, the church claiming the keeper drowned, a convenient silence that ignored the truth, that the tower, though destroyed, had never released what it held. And the beam was the echo of the anchor, the continuation of a duty no man could break, for something ancient had been bound beneath the stones, something patient and enduring, something that measured time differently. And still it waited, still it rose in light, still it called, and those who saw it later whispered of figures in the fog, drenched robes clinging to faceless forms, kneeling, arms outstretched, pressing against the water like worship or hunger, or both, figures seen only at the edge of perception, vanishing when approached, lingering when left behind. And the fishermen learned to fear the sight as much as the storm, to recognize the pull and turn away. But some did not, and for them, the sea delivered its judgment quietly, the same as always, empty vessels, torn and ruined, nets still wet, sails ripped, bodies gone, the wind carrying only echoes of the past keeper's journal, the fragments of charred paper, telling in whispers of iron, of kneeling shapes, of the anchor. And the villagers knew what the priests would not admit, knew that the light was not guidance but lure, not protection but demand, that the anchor, though broken in stone, persisted in its purpose. And the tide remembered the chains, and the flame, and the faces. And so the light turned still, slicing the fog with amber precision, circling, sweeping, pulling toward it what man leaves behind. And each time it burns across the water, another boat disappears, another story lost to the deep. And the villagers on shore do not speak of it, do not try to stop it, because what can they do against a light that should not shine, a sentinel of ruin, a call from beneath the waves, that knows names, knows fear, knows the rhythm of the human heart. And it continues, night after night, storm after storm, until those who remain can only watch in silence, counting wrecks, noting the days when fog rises thick, and the beam appears, remembering fragments of the keeper's warning, the scorched letters that told of kneeling figures and iron beneath the stones, and waiting, always waiting, knowing that the light that should not shine still does, and it will not cease, not until the sea has taken what it desires, and the anchor finally rests. And until then, the ruined shore will bear witness, and the waves will carry the story,
The light will sweep across the fog, the wrecks will appear along the rocks, and the silence from the shore will be louder than any storm. A quiet dread that settles like salt into bone, reminding the living that some lights do not guide, some beams do not warn, and some ruins, though destroyed, continue to reach, continue to call, continue to pull the unwary toward a fate from which there is no return, a fate measured not by men, but by the patient, ceaseless rhythm of the sea, and the thing that waits beneath it. And in this way the lighthouse lives on, in memory, in rumor, in the drifting glow that appears without reason, this without hand, cutting through fog where no tower stands, and those who see it understand, in the marrow of their bones, that they are witnesses only, not participants, and that the light, indifferent and eternal, will turn again and again. The sea stretched out in silver calm, a low fog rolling across the horizon like a thin veil, hiding the remnants of what had once been a sentinel against storms, the jagged bones of the lighthouse long claimed by wind and tide, its stones scattered and rusted iron bolts jutting from the cliffs like skeletal fingers, silent testimony to the years it had endured. And yet the researchers moved with careful steps along the shore, notebooks in hand, flashlights cutting cones of light through the mist, their breath rising in quiet clouds as they whispered among themselves, voices low, respectful, unsettled, for they had heard the stories, read the fragments, glimpsed the charred remnants of the keeper's journals, hidden and preserved, carrying warnings written in trembling hands and bitter ink, and now they sought to understand what remained, to measure, to catalogue, to make sense of the impossible. And the wind carried the faint smell of iron and salt, of pages burned and smoke long since vanished into the ether, and they felt it pressing against them, a weight unseen but unmistakable, a presence that lingered in the chill, brushing against the nape of the neck, moving in rhythms that were not the sea's. And that is when the first fragment was uncovered, pressed into the sand, charred at the edges yet legible. In the dim light, words half-formed but unmistakable. I did not keep the light, and the lead researcher leaned closer, gloved fingers trembling, tracing the letters as though the act itself might anchor the meaning, might tether it to reality. But the paper crumbled under the touch, brittle as dry bone, and the others stepped back, breath held, staring at the horizon where the fog seemed to shimmer, as though stirred by something beneath. And the silence of the water was profound, the only sound, the soft scrape of boots over sand, and the distant call of a solitary gull. Yet there was a vibration beneath the surface, a subtle pulse that made their teeth ache and their stomachs twist, a memory of storms long gone, of lanterns turning in iron cages, of faces pressed to glass and eyes wide in fear, of the keeper who had vanished into the tides, leaving only these fragments and warnings that no living person could fully interpret. And the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent of smoke, of something burned, something preserved. And the researchers glanced at one another, voices catching in their throats, the air suddenly thick, heavy with expectation, and one of them whispered aloud, almost involuntarily, "It kept him," and silence fell again. A silence so complete that the sea itself seemed to pause, as if listening, waiting. And they read the final fragment, voice low, shaking, each word deliberate. "I did not keep the light kept me." And the paper trembled in the fingers of the one holding it, brittle edges threatening to fall, a relic of a mind consumed by duty,
by fear, by something beyond comprehension. And though the sea lay calm before them, placid and reflective, the horizon betrayed a flicker, a single pulse of amber light that danced across the mist, fleeting and impossible, yet undeniable, cutting through the fog with intent, as though the long-dead tower reached out once more. A reminder that some chains are unbroken, that some sentinels endure. And the researchers stood frozen, notebooks forgotten at their feet, flashlights swinging uselessly, eyes tracing the beam that seemed alive. And the light did not waver, did not falter. and the wind whispered against their ears, carrying not words but memory, not voices but accusation, a quiet insistence that they were too late, that understanding alone could not protect them, that the sea remembered the keeper, and the anchor remained, though hidden, though shattered, and the light waited patiently, steadily, without hunger or malice, yet with the inevitability of something that cannot be ignored. And they shivered, not from cold, but from recognition, that this was the culmination of decades, of journals burned, and fragments preserved, of vanishing boats and empty nets, of faces glimpsed in fog. And in that moment, every eye turned to the horizon, where the pulse of amber winked and disappeared, leaving only mist and reflection, leaving only the calm sea, and the trembling witnesses, hearts hammering, palms slick, voices caught in throats, knowing the light would return, and when it did, no one could say who, if anyone, would resist its pull, who, if anyone, would survive to speak again. And the fragments in their hands burned in memory, more than in fire, carrying the bitter confession of a man who had served not a lantern, but a presence, not a duty, but a force that had claimed him entirely. And the researchers stood, still, silent, listening to the gentle lap of waves against the cliffs, feeling the weight of a legacy they could neither measure nor dismiss. As the horizon began to shimmer once more, a flicker just beyond sight, and they understood, in that quiet, tremulous moment, that the light, though intangible, though untethered to stone or hand, had survived all else, that endured beyond ruin, and journal, and priestly decree. And as the amber pulse winked across the sea again, fleeting and deliberate, they felt the truth settle upon them like salt, like iron, like inevitability itself. The keeper had not tended the lantern had tended him. That in the calm of that night, under the indifferent stars and the waiting fog, they realized that some lights are never extinguished, that some confessions are never complete, that the sea holds memory deeper than any human reckoning, and that all who watch it, all who record it, all who bear witness, become part of a story that is unfinished, unrelenting, and utterly beyond control. And though the horizon was empty once more, though the flicker vanished as quickly as it had appeared, the researchers did not speak, did not move, for the knowledge had taken root, and the sea remained calm, yet patient, and the air was thick with understanding. And in their silence, they acknowledged the bitter truth: the light had survived them all. It had survived the storms, the fire, the ruin, the journals, and the keeper, and it waited, as it always had, as it always would, for the next eyes to fall upon it, for the next hearts to be caught in its steady, unblinking gaze, for the next confessions to be written in fragments, carried in ash, whispered into the fog. And as they turned to leave, notebooks closed, papers carefully preserved, eyes still drawn to the horizon, a single pulse appeared once more, faint but undeniable, cutting a path through the mist. And they understood fully, finally, that the light would not be denied, and it had already begun to keep them. What is a keeper, if not a prisoner of his own light? We build towers to guard against the sea, but sometimes the sea does not want to be guarded. Sometimes it demands its due. And in the silence that followed, only one truth remained: the light was never ours to command.